both of those. And I won't go into a huge amount of detail, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, because the reason I'm not going into too much detail is they're huge programs of work, and they cross almost all marine activities, human activities within a very large area. And we'd be here for the next week talking about each one of them. So I'll keep it broad and high level mostly, but do feel free to ask any questions you want if you want me to drill down into any basic area or any other areas. Then I'll finish out with just a brief chat about the programme for government, which gives an idea of the priority for the marine area. And the next steps then I'll cover throughout the presentation. Okay, so to begin with the National Marine Planning Framework, the launch of the NMPF, it really marks an important step in the proper management of our seas. And there is such a diverse range of activities occurring within our maritime area, from aquaculture to wastewater treatment, from production of offshore renewable energy to petroleum. There's a real pressing need for a coordinated and coherent approach to decision making and governance of key human sectoral activities within our seas. And the NMPF is the state's response to this pressing need. So the NMPF itself is a long-term planning framework, and it goes out to 2040, so it covers the next 20 years. It sits as a parallel, as a sister document to the National Marine Planning Framework, which I'm sure anybody who's involved in Irish planning at any kind of level would understand what that is. It goes through each sector, so each marine activity, and talks about the guiding principles and objectives and the planning policies. And the planning policies are quite directive in this. And it covers everything, as I mentioned, from aquaculture right through to waste and water. So not quite the A to Z, but the A to W. It sets out a critical basis upon which all decision making for marine decisions will have to be made. And decision makers are obliged to meet the objectives of the NMPF, legally obliged to meet them. So it's a pretty important intervention the government is making in marine activity planning. And something that will be given a legal mechanism, legal grounding, will be the creation of zoning, so specific marine area zones, SMAZs, which we're not setting up right now, but where they are, but we will be doing it at some point in the near future. So that's just a brief overview. So what is marine spatial planning, I guess, will be the next thing I should cover. I like to think of it that I'm sorry, there we go. I like to think of it that it's almost like a jigsaw that we're trying to put together with each marine activity representing a different piece on that jigsaw board. And MSP, Marine Spatial Planning, is a process of bringing all those together into a coherent jigsaw, if you like. The kind of area, I think it's useful to picture in your mind what kind of area we're talking about here. As a broad scale, and some of you, I could be hidden, or I could be hiding, my video could be hiding that video, that map there on the right hand side of the screen. But we're talking about an area of 490,000 square kilometers. So the small blue area around the state of Ireland there, as you currently see the light blue, that's currently where we are legally allowed to consent development in. So that's called the foreshore area. And the bill that we're bringing through, the MPDM, will give us a jurisdiction or establish consenting jurisdiction right out to the continental shelf, the EEZ, and will cover our territorial seas from high water mark out. So the high water mark loosely can be defined as being the space where local government functional responsibility ends and the state begins, or the opposite would be true if you're looking at it from a local authority point of view. So just to bear that in mind, that this is a huge area, 7 times the size of the country. So the actual NMPF, will it apply? It will apply when it's launched in January or February. It will apply to any policy, program, plan, any development application, anything like that. So any decision maker must take into account the NMPF before making a decision on any kind of application they receive. Any policy maker developing a policy in government must meet the objectives of the NMPF, and my minister will have the right to object to anything that he or she feels doesn't meet those objectives. So to compare it briefly to the land planning system, which I think everybody will be quite familiar with if you've ever gone through planning permission for an extension or some kind of big development. On land, in terms of forward planning, and it might be worth saying that a normal planning system or a standard planning system would have 3 constituent parts. So that would be forward planning, the development management aspect, planning permissions, etc., and enforcement. So you need those 3 working coherently to have a successful planning system. And what we're trying to do here is introduce that kind of coherent system to the marine. So on land, our forward planning system would be at a high level, the national planning framework, and then we drill down into regional plans. Our development management system for dealing with planning permission proposals would include planning authorities such as On Board Planola and our county councils. And then we have an enforcement system to tackle unauthorized development. Whereas on the marine side, we have no forward planning, we have multiple development management systems, and we have multiple enforcement regimes, all working in their own kind of linear fashion. So how will MSP and the NMPF work? Well, one of the reasons why we're doing this is down to the European Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, which means that we have to have a marine special plan for Ireland lodged with the European Commission by the end of March 21. How we've done this is we've already transposed the MSP directive into Irish law, and that's covered in the Planning and Development Act 2018. So it's already, people are already legally obliged to use the NMPF, even though the NMPF is only being formally launched, the finalized version in January. Now that's going to be transposed into the new Marine Planning and Development Management Bill to consolidate that legal grounding. We've released a marine planning policy statement. We did it this time last year, which sets out the broad overarching principles and vision for the maritime area over a 6-year period. So that's out, that's live. The NMPF then, which I mentioned earlier on, will be the forward planning aspect and will provide the policy base for decisions to be made. And I suppose give a vision to more fundamental pieces, including enforcement and the consent structure going forward. And, you know, into the future then, probably late 2021 and into 22, 23, we will be doing a more regional take on marine spatial planning, so regional plans. And finally, to just bottom out this theme of comparing it to land planning, you can see there we're taking a very similar approach to what it has been a very successful planning system approach. So on land planning, but just to say the overarching government policy obviously sets the direction for both sides, and that could come in the shape of primary legislation, regulations, program for government, European directives, etc. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about overarching government policy. So in 2015, there was a land planning policy statement released, which gave, as I said, the overarching direction of travel for land planning in this country. We've also done one of those on the marine planning policy statement side. The National Planning Framework, which is half of Project Ireland 2040, is well established now in this state. I think it was about 2017 that was launched. And the National Marine Planning Framework will be its sister document covering the maritime area. Then at a regional level, the RSES strategies, which are rolled out by regional assemblies. We will be taking a somewhat different tack on that, in that our regional maritime plans will probably be sea-based, given that all of our local authorities don't have a coastal frontier. So I would imagine we would probably have three, is what the way my thinking is at the moment. One on the Irish Sea on the east coast, one on the Celtic Sea on the south coast, and then on the Atlantic facing seaboard. And then we get into kind of a more localized approach with coastal partnerships and Bay Area plans, which I'd hope to launch a couple of pilot programs on next year on that. And they would be loosely, I suppose you could frame them, and I've kind of made smaller arrows there on account of that, to county development plans and local area plans. So same, but different, as I say. So who rolls this out? Well, the Marine Planning Policy and Legislation team, which I'm part of, and we are responsible for both the NMPF and the Marine Planning and Development Management Bill. As well as us, we have a broad overarching advisory group, which is made up of a lot of constituent parts, spreading across all sectors, and also public sector organization sector, and it covers the economic, environmental, and recreation or sport pillars that the NMPF tries to kind of put forward. We also, and that's chaired by our minister, by the way, the Marine Legislation Steering Group, which is a cross-departmental group. The marine activities and policies are quite defragmented across government departments. So this group endeavours to bring all of those together as one, and to make collective decisions. And also, if we need data or information, it's a great conduit for that. That's chaired by ourselves as an interdepartmental group, and there's also a legislation steering group, which is chaired by the Department of the Taoiseach. We have done an SEA and an appropriate assessment on the NMPF, which was out for public consultation up until last April, and a final statement will be released with the NMPF in, as I said, in January. They're available to view, by the way, on our website if anyone would like to see all of those documents. And RPS were our consultants on that one, and did a fine job. So the actual structure of the NMPF, so I would imagine that there will be some people on this call, and either from a developer's point of view or from a decision-making point of view, who will be involved in these kind of applications, policy, etc. So this structure might be of use in terms of explaining where we were coming from with it. So there are certain things that apply to all policies, and we call them overarching marine planning policies. They're applicable to every kind of proposal or policy. And just for ease of use, when I say the word proposal, I'm talking about policies and development applications, the full gamut. So they're grouped together, again, according to the social development pillars of social, environmental, and economic, and they're applicable to everything really. So it's the first port of call for any decision maker, is to look at the overarching policies and to decide whether they apply to the application or the proposal to hand. We've explained them in as much as possible, and we have then supplemented them by sector-specific policies. So the NMPF itself is split into two areas: the overarching marine planning policies and the sector-specific ones. So, as I said, the three high-level headings are environmental, social, and economic, but we've broken them down into more constituent parts. As you can see there, I think there's about 18 of them. And they do what it says on the tin there. And just to give an example of how we've written these, they're quite directive, whereas other kind of national frameworks, and well, there is only one really national planning framework, would be objective based. These are more prescriptive and directive towards decision making. So you can see there on climate change, proposals that support a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions will be supported. That's quite plain speaking. There must be a reason. You must support these things if the proposal meets that criteria. And how you do that is that you see if they demonstrate for the lifetime of the proposal, and that's quite important, that they've considered the impacts of climate change and coastal change, and have incorporated appropriate adaptation measures where necessary, etc., etc. And these proposals, if they're to be supported, must demonstrate those three things there, that they'll avoid, minimize, or mitigate against any risks. So again, two things to note there, that the proposals are, the policies are very prescriptive, they're directive, and secondly, that they're there to support a healthy ocean environment. At the same time, the balance has to be struck between the other pillars, such as recreation and economic. So also, we have a coexistence policy in there, and a lot of the theme of this NMPF is coexistence. So we want policies and activities to work together in as much as possible. And this will be a running theme throughout all of these things. And probably a good example of that would be offshore renewable energy and fishing, stroke aquaculture. We really want those things to sit down and talk and to work together in terms of achieving that coexistence goal. The sector activity ones are obviously specific to each marine activity. It talks about the type of activity supported. It goes through the objectives that government has for each of those activity. It also shows you our thinking of how we achieve, how we got to the landing point for those objectives. So the background policies at the European level and at a government level. So if further reading, I suppose, for decision making or developers. And in some cases, they'll be supplemented by specific zoning once that process is in place. So to give an example of what we mean by sector-specific ones, here are the 16 different sectors. So these are the primary human activities that we have pinpointed within our maritime area. And we go through each of those in the NMPF with a variety of planning policies for each of them and background to those. The example I'm going to use today is offshore renewable energy. So the high-level vision for this is that we want to establish Ireland as a world leader in ORE. It also, well, ORE really ticks so many boxes in terms of the current programme for government, which is looking to decarbonise or become carbon neutral by 2050, while also having renewable energy account for 70% of its energy usage by 2030. So ORE is a big part of that. And the planning policy is going to back that up. So policy number one there is proposals that assist the state in meeting the government's target of reaching 3.5 gigawatts. And that's actually increased. I should update my slide here to 5 gigawatts now in the current programme for government by 2030. I think we will reach that. But again, this is just to highlight the definitive nature of this policy, and that's quite prescriptive again. And it shows you that decisions on ORE development should be informed by consideration of requirement of other activities of national importance described in the NMPF. So again, quite straightforward, I think. And I think there are 11 of those different objectives and policies. So to back these policies up, we have included supporting material, as I said, local, national, European and international contexts. We have cross-reference where there's crossover or cross-cutting policies. We've included as many maps as we can to demonstrate where, for instance, offshore renewable energy proposals are currently being looked at. Um, and our consultation has actually highlighted a number of gaps in the current draft NMPF, and we'll be moving between now and the finalised NMPF to update those maps and to carry additional ones. But the NMPF itself will be a living document, so we'll be updating these things all along as we can. And there's an example of one of the maps we developed for the NMPF, one of many, as I said. And this shows the current infrastructure that exists around the state waters, and also some of the ones that where development is at a relatively advanced stage. And that will be updated again for January. So the implementation of the NMPF itself, because it's all well and good having a high-level strategy, but when the rubber hits the road, as I say, we need to have a clear roadmap of how we're going to roll this out. So I suppose until the bill will be coming out sometime next year, and I'll talk about that again, and that will give the legal grounding for a number of things within the NMPF, such as the SMAZs, Strategic Marine Activity Zones. At the same time, as I'm talking, we're developing a marine plan digital tool, which I think is a real game changer, and I hope it is in terms of marine planning. It is a GIS map of the maritime area, and it will eventually include all marine development, where it's happening, what's happening into the future, what zones are where, and it will assist developers and decision makers in seeing what's going on around the application or proposal to hand, and what's government policy in this area. So it doesn't just give what's there and what's coming, it also gives a policy around certain areas from both a geographic point of view, where that's possible, but also from a sectoral point of view too. And I think that's going to be very useful to people. For anyone of our the Irish viewers here, you might be used to using MyPlan, and this will kind of cause a seamless interaction between those two planning tools. And MyPlan is an excellent tool, I think, and I really hope that the Marine Spatial Planning digital tool will be the same. We also will be developing statutory marine planning guidelines in the area of both generic development management guidelines and also ones that are specific to wind guidelines in the first instance. But we'll be rolling these out right across all marine activities into the future. And all of those guidelines, statutory guidelines, will be sent out for public consultation. So you or anyone you know can have your say in how we've developed those. And that really will serve as a step-by-step guide for decision makers as well as developers. And all of these things will be publicly available, of course. We are developing a conference series. As we had our first one in May, again, like yourselves here in a virtual forum. Marine planning is quite new to Ireland. So we felt it would be useful to begin a conference series and workshop program, particularly with local authorities who will have to, I suppose, learn new skills and take on new functions for marine planning, given that they're going to be functions are going to be devolved from central government to local authorities over the next period of time. We're also working with the Irish Planning Institute to develop a program of learning. The CIEEM County Council Management Agency, City and Council Management Agency, and the Office of the Planning Regulator and others to roll these programs out to make sure that there's no duplication here, and that we're getting the best we can in terms of training. And um, probably something worth noting is we've also stepped into middle ground here in terms of interaction between certain maritime activities. So we will be establishing a working group to liaise between offshore renewable energy and fisheries in terms of communication. So some of you will be familiar with flow guidelines, FLOW, that were developed a number of years ago by the Marine Management Organization in England. And these won't be dissimilar. So we'll be developing communication protocols essentially between ORE and fisheries to minimize any conflict in this area. And I'm looking forward to that kind of engagement. And specific projects that we're working on, there's a number of these, but two to note is an ongoing one at the moment, a Seascape character assessment. And this has been a really interesting one because it hasn't been done, I suppose. Like we're used to landscape, but not necessarily seascape. I know in Wales they tend to use seascape, but we're trying to go a step further on it. So we're working very closely with our partners, the Marine Institute, in developing this, and really they're leading out on it. And we have published a report in September there, and we'll be coming back hopefully with something finalised over the next few months. But that's a really interesting project. Second one there to note is CIEEM Atlantic, which there could well be a couple of people on this call who are involved in this as well. And the issues that are related there, land sea interaction, cross-border management guidance. So they're looking at areas, particularly on the island of Ireland. There's two, Lough Foyle and Carlingford, which I'm very interested to see what challenges are identified and what potential solutions are put in there, because I'm keen to work with our Northern Irish partners to develop those cross-border initiatives. And they are involved in that CIEEM Atlantic project as well. So just to update on what's happened since the current program for government was launched in July, August. So as I mentioned earlier, the ORE targets have increased from 3.5 gigs to 5 gigs. We'll see. There's also a cessation of support for Shannon a gas terminal, and no new licenses for oil and gas exploration. Now that was announced, I think, this time last year, and the program for government just copper fastened that decision. From my own point of view, I'm looking forward to seeing Project Ireland Marine 2040, and that'll be part of the Project Ireland 2040 Delivery Board, I presume, and it will provide leadership into the future and oversight into the NMPF and the NPDM. I'm sure a lot more on the marine activity side. And it really shows the joined up approach the government is taking to the marine and land planning and indeed investment into the future. Okay, so the timeline there, we are currently analysing submissions. We're nearly there, that we received our public consultation agenda in April. We will have a final NMPF to government by the end of the year. March 21, as I mentioned a few slides ago, is our cut-off date for getting our NMPF, or final marine special plan, into the European Commission. We will make that deadline. And then we'll look to establish Project Ireland Marine after that date, as set out in the programme for government. So the second programme that's run from my unit, anyone who's following the NPDM will, I suppose, know that the current status of it is that in January of this year, we published a general scheme of the bill. And since publication, actually, better skip on to this slide for a sec. Since publication, we've been undergoing further policy development. We've made quite a few changes to the scheme as published in January. And those intensive engagements are ongoing with the Department of Communications, Environment, Communications and Climate. And they lead out in the development of provisions in relation to legislation specific to offshore renewable energy. Excuse me, my throat is getting dry. In addition to that policy development work, the main other focus has been the ongoing work with the OPC, the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, other departments and agencies. So it's a very broad bill. It covers a lot of maritime activities. And in order to inform our position on enforcement, we undertook a review of this area, and we're expecting a decision from government very shortly. I won't say much more on that, but and we're also working with the local authority system and on board Panola in order to develop their capacity to take on development roles, consent roles under this legislation. The programme for government has set a very challenging deadline, a target, I should say, to enact this legislation within 9 months, which brings us to March. It's very, very difficult. And we're assessing the steps necessary at the moment now to see how we can reach that. So it's a cross-government challenge, which does help. But there are a lot of departments and agencies whose input is required into this. So a lot of our work is in corralling and collaborative efforts to bring forward this critical piece of legislation and really get it over the line. So the vision, just to go back one there, is it will provide the legal grounding for the entire marine planning system. And these are, I suppose, the two important elements of it. It's to create that new single state consent regime within the state. Anyone who's any kind of involvement in development applications will know it's quite a frustrating system in that there's a lot of elements and a lot of steps in order to get a proposal over the line. That's equally frustrating for people who have to deal with these planning applications as well, believe me. And also to instill a single planning permission consent step for all projects to include the environmental impact assessment, among other things. Okay, so a note here that the programme for government mentioned that the bill must be Aarhus Convention compliant. I'm sure it will be, and it'll be informed by the Offshore Renewable Energy Development Plan, which I believe will be launched in the next few months. Now, that might take 18 months to do, but the NMPF, I would say, will be more informed than the bill, because I would hope to get that bill over the line early next year. There's also a transition protocol involved in the background, and that will be for offshore renewable energy relevant projects, or projects that have been deemed to be relevant projects. So these are projects at a relatively advanced stage who are kind of caught in between the old system and the new, and they've elected to transition into the new stream, even though the old system, the foreshore consent system, is still in place. But I think it's an advantage for them, certainly, and we'll get them into on board Panola, who will be the eventual planning authority for planning permission of strategic importance into the marine area. It'll get them into that system a lot quicker than if they were to wait through the foreshore system. The actual sequence under the new bill will look something like this. So the first part will be our zoning. Now that won't be ready for 3 or 4 years, but I put it in there as an indicative kind of thing that's coming down the line. But really, we're looking at the starting point for the foreseeable future being the maritime area consent. So any application will be into the relevant minister here. So for instance, to stick on the team of offshore renewable energy, that will be with the Minister for Environment, and he or she then will give consent based on a number of factors, which I've outlined in the slide next. And I'll flick between these two slides. So that maritime area consent really looks at the spatial conflict issue, if any, the financial and technical capability of developers, the public interest in dealing with this development, and it will protect the property interests of the state. And that'll be all for the relevant minister to do. And just to briefly go back then, the planning application. So once a developer receives a MAC consent, maritime area consent, they can then proceed to submit their full application to On Board Penola. And On Board Penola then take it from there in terms of the planning permission element, which includes consultation and a planning decision. So that planning permission element is the public participation element. It includes the environmental assessments, and as I'm just reading out there, but the compliance of proposals with proper planning initiatives. So it'll give On Board Penola the kind of land-sea interaction, because most maritime developments of a strategic nature, and I mean bigger ones there, have that land-sea interaction. So even if it's a wind farm 20 kilometers off the coast, it still has to have a landfall element. So that's where the board will oversee both of those, rather than one planning authority doing one and another planning authority doing another, which is currently the system. And then just to flick back to that other one, when an applicant receives their planning decision, that's when their maritime area consent kicks in. So they get both on one day, I suppose. They don't have to go back to the department, which they currently would have to do. So the MAC is a conditional MAC when it's given, and it becomes a real MAC when they get their planning permission from the board. Okay. And that's what we're hoping to introduce in the NPDM bill, that new sequence. The governance of all of this, as I said, is probably going to be under Project Ireland 2040. We're going to be working out over the next few months. And that really brings me to the end. My throat is thanking me. That's bringing me to the end of that presentation. But I realize there's an awful lot there. And that was something of a whistle-stop tour. But I'm very happy to try to answer any questions if there are any, or take any comments.
Thanks a million, Conor. Yeah, you're right. There's a lot there, and a lot for us in CIEEM to interact with your department as well. We did actually have a few questions come in. Now, they kind of came in while you were talking, so we might have to see if you've answered any of them. And if anybody else has a question that they want to put to Conor, if you want to put it in the chat, and I can put them to him. So I'm just going to pick one here. So have you a baseline environmental assessment of the marine environment which can be consulted when looking for information for consents? I don't know, is that something that you would know? Or?
No, it's a good question. It's something I'm working towards. At the moment, it's very much done on a case-by-case basis, and generally by developers, and then that data and information isn't shared readily publicly. And what I want to introduce is a more sharing culture in terms of the public sector organization, the relevant one, will actually broadcast and publicize that those environmental assessments, be they undertaken by developers, which they probably won't want to hear me saying that, but that's where we want to go with this. And I'm not afraid to say that. But also assessments that we're doing ourselves. And we're working in the background in terms of the scalability of how we can make that happen. And certainly for the SMAZs, the Strategic Marine Activity Zones, we will absolutely be publishing the environmental assessments that we undertake as part of that SMAZ approach, which will be comprehensive, to say the least. Now, obviously, if you're talking about that from a developer's point of view, things change over time. So just because we give that information out or make it publicly accessible, it doesn't mean that you mightn't have to update that with your own assessment if, let's say, 2 or 3 years have passed since that assessment has been undertaken. But to directly answer your question, we have some baseline environmental assessments. They're not very comprehensive, but I'm working towards making that a reality and building up that knowledge in the shape of a database that you and anyone else who's interested will be able to access and use.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. I have another question here. I'm going to ask it, but I'm not sure. It was, could Conor outline how the planning consenting process will operate for offshore projects? Was that the last slide, or
Yeah.
That was the last slide there?
That was it. So, sorry, Jill, to put across here.
Yeah.
Or Liz, to put across here, but yeah, it's straightforward. I hope, in my mind anyway, it's straightforward. So it's the maritime area consent is the first port of call. The planning permission is the second port of call.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
perfect.
So that's it. Yeah.
So where is the marine plan in terms of protected marine areas, the designation of, and in terms of impacts with offshore developments? Are the guidelines in marine appropriate assessments the same as terrestrial appropriate assessments, or is there any difference? I think that's two questions there, is it? So
Yep.
the first is protected marine areas.
Okay, so actually, I'll take the second one first, if you don't mind, because
Okay.
it's straightforward. Yes, they're the same ones. It's all under the birds habitats directive, so the AAs are the same. And they may have to look at different things, but they are, for all intents and purposes, the same thing. So sorry, back to the first question then, the marine plan in terms of MPAs, what you're talking about here. I suppose to give the brief overview on that, the target for MPAs has changed somewhat in the program for government. I think it's a 10% minimum by 2030. So 10% of our sea area will be designated as a marine protected area by 2030, and we will reach that. But they've also the government have also looked for that to be increased to 30% by 2030, which is more challenging, obviously. Now, my colleagues in marine environment, who's also in our department, have just submitted a report to the Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government and Heritage, with the findings of their advisory group report and their public consultation. And I think last Thursday that report was released, and it is available on our website. And that sets out a broad plan on how they're going to reach that. It's a good report, and I'd recommend anyone who's interested in the area to have a look at that. And the constituent elements of that plan will be included in the NMPF. Now, I suppose that question is very broad in terms of how will the designation of, and in terms of, so there is a designation process under that report. I won't go into it now because it's complex, but what I will say is in terms of the impacts of offshore developments, that's the nitty-gritty of this. And I think when people hear of marine protected areas, they have a vision, some people have a vision of that nothing else can take place in that, only ocean health and environmental protection. But actually, nothing could be further from the truth. It's just that some activities may be precluded. But there are quite a few offshore wind farms, for instance, located in marine protected areas around the globe. There's nothing to say we can't do that here. There are some marine protected areas where fishing takes place. So, it depends on the category of marine protected area, and it depends on what you're actually looking to protect. So there could be 4 or 5 different levels or types of marine protected area. And I don't want to talk about a policy area that's not my own and that is a colleague's of mine. But just to say that, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and each of these MPAs, in theory and no doubt in practice, will have a management plan attached to them, and they'll be unique for the most part to that MPA.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks, Conor. I think there's one final question that was put into the chat, and again, I encourage everyone to put a question before we have to finish off for the day. So how does this link into the marine plan developed by the Marine Department in Northern Ireland? So I think you mentioned a cross-border project in Carlingford Lough, but are you communicating more with Northern Ireland?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say we're not creating our plan in isolation. nor did our Northern Irish colleagues create their plan in isolation, and they're very much colleagues of ours. So we viewed we developed, I should say, our plan with a view to looking at their plan as well at the same time, and to make sure that there was no conflict and that there isn't. And that's also to say that we did the same for plans from our English colleagues and our Welsh colleagues, because their territorial areas also touch up against ours. That doesn't sound good, but so yeah, like we look at all interactives, and we're part of a Western European Isles group called the Six Administrations, which doesn't meet as often as it should, but is still in place. And that covers ourselves, Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales, and the Isle of Man, who have their own marine area as well. And that fits into an area, or a body called the Six Administrations, and it's to deal with these that exact issue. So interactivity between these plans. And just to give an example of one area where we have to look at interactivity: submarine cables. No boundaries. So that's an area where interaction needs to happen between those two plans, and the plans need to cooperate as one. Outside the European Union, certainly that's going to create an added challenge, but you know, it's not insurmountable by any stretch of the imagination.
Oh, very good. Okay, so I think that's it, Conor. There doesn't seem to be anything else coming in for you, but I just like, on the behalf of the Irish section and myself, to thank you very much for taking the time to chat with us here today. It was very informative and interesting talk, as Jill said in the chat there. So thanks a million, Conor. That was great.
Thanks very much, Liz. Appreciate it.
For joining. Oh, sorry, Conor. I talked over you there.
Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks. Bye.